My name is Dwayne Quasey Wright Barrington III, and I have the honor of serving as Assistant Professor of Higher Education Administration, as well as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives here at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development. Not more than a couple of feet away from me, we here at the George Washington University have been engulfed, hosted, visited by a so-called Gaza encampment in which students are protesting. And at those protests, you will see signs as well as hear chants against the concept of Zionism. But what is Zionism, right? Do the students know? Do we know as a community and as an academic institution? Can we investigate with some facts the concepts to sort of understand not just what the students are protesting against, but how other students may interpret that protest as well. In an effort to fulfill our academic mission, we here at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development have developed a series called What Do We Mean By?, in which we actually bring an expert in to, can I say, demystify a topic in under an hour or so. But we decided that this topic was going to take a bit more, so we added 15 minutes. But today we have a very acclaimed and esteemed expert, as someone that I have enjoyed calling over the last year or so a colleague, and I hope to one day earn the right to call a friend, and that's Dr. Miriam Elman. Dr. Elman, I'll read your bio. Miriam has served since 2019 as the Executive Director of the Academic Engagement Network, an educational nonprofit that builds nationwide networks of university faculty and administrators to counter anti-Semitism and improve campus climate for Jewish students and all students. Before taking her position at AEN, she was a tenured Associate Professor of Political Science at Syracuse, where she held the title of the Robert D. McNair Professor of Teaching Excellence in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Dr. Elman previously taught at Arizona State University and spent several years as a fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. An award-winning scholar and a teacher, Dr. Elman has edited 7 books and is the author of nearly 100 peer-reviewed articles and essays. She received a BA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as a PhD from Columbia University, which has been in the news of late. GW is honored to welcome Dr. Elman. And before I let Dr. Elman go, let me just say this. We come here today in the spirit of exploration, in the spirit of inquiry, and in the spirit to really engage in what for many is a very hard and fraught topic. Please know that anyone that intends to disrupt that spirit will be removed. We've never had to do that here at GW. I hope we don't have to do that today. I've seen this presentation before. For some of you, 100% I will guarantee some things that Dr. Elman will describe to you may offend you. You may not agree with it. Some things in your heart of hearts you may think just are outright lies. But we aren't here to actually get to agreement. We're here to explore a certain point of view and hope that everyone that decides to stay here will engage in that manner. And with that said, Dr. Elman, please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dwayne. You run a tight ship here, so we're starting very much on time. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this exceptional series. It's such a terrific idea to gather together to debate terms and concepts. And so I really do appreciate everybody attending as well. Some of my remarks, as Dwayne mentioned, will draw on a talk I gave last year in a year-long professional development program that my nonprofit hosts for diversity officials. And Dwayne, you've participated in that program, and I just want to say thank you for your commitment and your partnership and all that you do here at GW to instill a welcoming and inclusive learning community. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk about a topic that has been central to my research for some time. But I want to start just by saying that it is a very fraught time to be engaging on this topic. The Israel-Hamas war is deeply personal. The incidents on campuses are disturbing. Jewish and Muslim, Israeli and Palestinian students are experiencing a sharp rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in our country and on our schools. Many feel a lack of psychological and even physical safety. So there's a lot of pain and trauma, and it's sometimes difficult to address these concepts analytically and conceptually, but that's what I want to try to do here in this session, and to really offer a framework for understanding Zionism and its relationship to Jewish history, as well as Jewish identity. Let me also say from the outset that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Even a critical engagement with the concept of Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic. But sometimes the criticism and the discourse surrounding this concept can cross the line. And so Dwayne asked me to speak about Zionism as a concept and also what we mean by anti-Zionism. And so my talk is going to be sort of two halves. And I'll try to do this in 45 minutes, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. It may be helpful to start with Theodor Herzl and his Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which was published nearly 130 years ago. And it set out the need for a Jewish state and became the roadmap to make it happen. The subtitle of this short pamphlet was An Attempt at a Modern Solution to the Jewish Question. What was the Jewish question? How to address and how to counter anti-Semitism. Now, Theodor Herzl, some of you may know, was an assimilated secular Jew. He was an Austrian journalist. He was gravely concerned about the future of Jews in Europe, and he anticipated correctly the looming dangers. Jews had gained citizenship rights. They were adopting the language and customs of the Europeans where they lived. They were, though, viewed with suspicion and hate. To Herzl, the only solution was for Jews to return to their native homeland, to reestablish and to reconstitute a thriving, independent Jewish state. So for Herzl, Zionism was very much a byproduct of anti-Semitism. Had European society fully welcomed the Jews, he would have been very happy to remain a writer and a journalist in Vienna, and he often said that in his speeches and in his lectures. In essence, for Herzl and for other Zionists, this movement for self-determination for Jews, a Jewish nationalism in the age of nation building, was to a large extent reactive, right? It sort of was a necessary response or reaction to persecution and oppression. And the image on the slide is actually the cover page of Herzl's pamphlet that was republished in 1946 in Poland, 2 years before the establishment of the State of Israel. It celebrated the 50th anniversary of Herzl's work. And there's also here the best known photograph of Theodor Herzl was taken in 1901 during the 5th Zionist Congress. Herzl is looking at the Rhine in Basel in Switzerland. And this was just a few years before his death in 1904. He died very young. By the way, yesterday was his birthday, May 2nd, 1860s. This is very young, but very influential a persona in Jewish history. Now, anti-Zionism is not always anti-Semitic, and certainly it was not historically. Before the founding of the State of Israel, Zionism had to win a debate. And as philosopher Michael Walzer says, quote, most versions of anti-Zionism actually appeared among the Jews. There were many anti-Zionist groups before 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. And it simply would not be accurate to call those groups anti-Semitic. They simply had a different idea of how to resolve or solve the Jewish question. That is, how to address and how to combat anti-Semitism. And at the time, many religious Jews thought that a return to Palestine and the reconstitution of a Jewish nation in the land of Israel would actually need to wait for messianic times, that it was sacrilegious to try to do this in the here and now in the 19th century. It would have to wait for the Messiah. Religious Zionism would emerge much later, and especially after 1967. But in the late 19th century, there were many more anti-Zionist religious Jews than there were Zionist religious Jews among them. There were also many Jews in Europe and in the United States who held firm to the belief that Jews could continue to secure citizenship rights in the countries where they lived. And in fact, if you read about Herzl and his life and his times, you will find that Herzl was the butt of ridicule. It was really a difficult slog for him to make his case, particularly in West European Jewish circles. When he spoke to Jewish communities in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Austria, they would retort, and this is a quote, "We are French, we are German, we are Austrian, we are Italian citizens of the Jewish faith." By contrast, Herzl had a lot more traction in Eastern Europe and in Russia. We can also consider here the US reform movement in the 19th century and go back to 1885. Rabbinical leaders affiliated with the reform movement rejected Zionism, rejected Jewish nationalism. They declared themselves a Jewish religious community and stated emphatically neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of any laws concerning the Jewish state should be our prerogative. This became known as the Pittsburgh Platform, and by 1937, it would be rejected at a gathering of Reform rabbis in Columbus, Ohio, and Palestine was then referred to as, quote, a land hallowed by memories and hopes. The platform affirmed an obligation of all Jews to aid in the upbuilding of a, quote, Jewish homeland, which would be a center for Jewish cultural and spiritual life. The Pittsburgh Platform, though, didn't completely disappear. Its key anti-Zionist principles found their way into the American Council for Judaism, an organization of Reform rabbis who disavowed Zionism on the grounds that it would open up American Jews to the claim that they were not real Americans. That is the dual loyalty canard, that Jewish nationalism would prevent the full assimilation of Jews into the American mainstream. And this is a great book by Tom Kalski. It's a fascinating account of the debates within the American Jewish community in the 1940s in this time period. But it's important to note that after the Holocaust and after the establishment of the State of Israel, this anti-Zionism was basically expunged. It was expunged even from the organized reform movement, and certainly from major organizational Jewish life in the United States. And the American Council for Judaism was effectively disbanded. I'll have a bit more to say about that in a moment. There was another anti-Zionist path within the labor movement, and particularly in the Jewish Labor Bund in Poland, in Russia, and also to some extent in the United States, also launched in the 19th century. The aim, to unite all workers, and they saw themselves as representing a minority of Jewish workers in this larger movement. The Bund's position was that Jews could lead a normal life, again, in the countries where they lived, with the dissolution of a capitalist society and a successful class struggle. So it is important to recognize these different groups that were debating with Herzl and with other Zionists and with the emerging Zionist movement. I want to share a colleague of yours you may know, Michael Brenner, also in DC at American University, has written extensively about this time period in Jewish history in the 19th century, the formation of Zionism as a modern movement. And he's not the only one to note this, but his work, and particularly this article, might be very helpful to understand this moment. And he argues that Herzl's vision, his Zionist vision, again, it had to win an argument. And the way it did that was because it resonated. It resonated and began to resonate even more among Jews, this sort of notion of Jewish restoration at a time when nationalism was emerging as a very important way to secure rights and justice for minority peoples. So nationalism was really a key motif of the 19th century, certainly 19th century Europe, and Zionism placed Jews right in the middle of it. Now, it also was about creating a radically different future for the Jewish people. Jews would at last seize control of their own destiny. Smith College professor and my good friend and colleague, Donna Devine, notes that Jews would be, quote, liberated from the rule of the rabbis, no less from the rule of the czar, and from the most timeless instrument of persecution, the mob. And so for Herzl and his colleagues, Zionism was a means for Jews to overcome the shame of passivity and to, quote, restore their honor, to become masters of their own fate, as Harvard scholar Derek Pensler notes in a very useful new book of his. In proposing the building of a national homeland, Zionism provided Jews with a sacred enterprise that would be authorized by their own work and their own actions. It was work rather than the study of scripture that would be the vehicle for legitimizing possession of the land and creating community and transforming place that was holy into an actual reconstituted homeland. And it's important to understand that in the 19th century, and certainly well into the 20th century, neither the Jews nor the Arabs of Palestine perceived each other as a people deserving of collective rights. Jewish leadership at the time saw the Arabs as individuals who would greatly benefit from modernity that Jewish immigration would bring. And you can see that from this this quote from a famous letter that one of the Zionist leaders, Martin Buber, at the time, there are many actually university buildings where I went at Hebrew University named after Martin Buber, is very influential intellectual, and particularly in the university system in those years in pre-state Israel and the early years of the foundation of the state. And he sent this letter to Mahatma Gandhi. And you can see from it, you know, that the way in which the Jewish people who were coming to the land thought of the Arab population living there, that in a sense all boats would be raised. Arabs, meanwhile, viewed Jews also as individuals to be tolerated, but not as a people, and certainly not as a nation. And for the most part, with only few exceptions, Jews who came to Palestine were viewed by most of the Arab leadership and much of a civil society at the time as European colonial intruders. Now, some scholars argue that colonization rather than colonialism is a more appropriate term for understanding the dynamics of pre-1948 Arab-Jewish relations. First of all, the Jews had no imperial sponsor. The first wave of Jewish immigration, the first Aliyah in the mid-1880s, they were refugees. They were fleeing persecution. They did not represent a mother country or a metropole like other French, Portuguese, and German colonists did. The Zionists did have support from Britain for a time, but then completely lost that support when Britain curbed Jewish immigration in the 1930s at the Jewish people's greatest time of need, actually. And with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Great Britain's support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine did provide Zionism with a degree of international legitimacy. It was important for Herzl and fellow Zionists to have that support, even before it had earned any widespread backing from Jews themselves. But still, the Zionist movement was never a project of the British Empire or any other imperial power. The other thing that's important to remember and note is that Zionists were not keen on recreating a little Europe in Palestine. The revival of the Hebrew language, for example, highlights an effort to create a distinctively non-European Jewish culture. Zionist settlement was meant to create a self-sufficient Jewish population. It was based on the 19th century perspective of the homestead, the notion that land ownership rested with those who actually worked the land. And according to this line of argument, Jewish Zionist settlement was premised on colonizing the land, actually the opposite of settler colonialism, characterized by the exploitation of indigenous labor. With some exceptions, like in the northern part of the country and in the citrus industry, Zionists actually hired Jews. They did not hire non-Jewish workers. Arabs didn't work for the new Jewish landlords who were buying real estate from the Turks. Instead, Arab laborers found themselves out of jobs. And that certainly increased animosity in the run-up to 1948. Could the Zionists have done things differently? Had they known what the results would be, the animosity they were creating, the slums in Tel Aviv filled with Arab laborers who were out of work? Maybe they would have done something differently. It is a story to tell, and there is some scholarship on this time period, and particularly what happened in the citrus industry is so different than what happened in other industries, in agricultural industries at the time. Now, Zionism succeeded because it was closely connected to the love of the land, of course, to what we call chibat Zion, translated as the love of Zion, the attachment of Jews to their ancient homeland. And for the vast majority of Jews, Zion is not external to the faith, but an inherent part of the faith. And Jews across religious denominations pray for the return to Zion. That is in the daily liturgy. The longing for return to the land is deeply embedded in religious practice. There are important Jewish holidays connected to the land of Israel. We just celebrated Passover. It ends with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." Over half of the 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible can only be observed in Israel, in the land of Israel. They cannot be observed by a Jew living outside of Israel. Half of the 613 commandments or mitzvot in the Hebrew Bible. The list goes on. You probably have been maybe to a Jewish marriage ceremony, the custom for the groom to break a glass. In the midst of the happiest of occasions, Jews must remember the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, hence the breaking of the glass as a symbolic reminder. Another way of thinking about this is that Zionism as the love of Zion is as central to Judaism as is keeping kosher, as is observing the Sabbath. Now, not everyone observes the Sabbath, and not everyone keeps kosher, and not all Jews are Zionists. But these are still three very core expressions of Jewish identity. Zionism today is so normative and so mainstream that in poll after poll, an overwhelming majority of American Jews say that Zionism, the love of Zion, an attachment to Israel, is a key element of their Judaism. We know that from a Pew Research poll from 2021. 8 out of 10 American Jews say caring about Israel is very important to what being Jewish means to them. So that is an important component, but I still want to go back to Herzl, that in a sense, Zionism won out from among its detractors because of anti-Semitism and the massive trauma of the Holocaust, a state for the Jews that would be a refuge, a safe haven for a persecuted people, the Russian pogroms, anti-Jewish discrimination in the wake of World War I, discriminatory policies against Jews in the 20s, 30s, and finally the rise of the Nazi state in Germany legitimized Zionism as a political project in the eyes of many of its one-time skeptics. And Michael Brenner, at the end of that chapter I had on the previous slide, says, let's be realistic. The skeptics, the Bundists, the others were either murdered in the Nazi crematoria or in the killing fields of Europe, or they became converted Zionists. I could spend another half a day on the various literature about pre-1948 and Zionism today, but this gives you a little bit of the background of the concept. And I want to move now to anti-Zionism and what that looks like today, and in particular what it feels like to many Jews, including students on your campus and on other campuses. And for this, I want to actually go back a bit and think about the roots of contemporary anti-Zionism. And it may be helpful to have a look at historian Stephen Norwood's work. He is a historian at University of Oklahoma. He's written extensively about anti-Semitism in the United States, particularly in the 60s and 70s, and how it manifested in parts of the left, in the Communist Party, in the New Left, in parts of the Black nationalist movement. And what he shows is that an intense hatred toward Israel and toward Zionism emerged in these movements, and very much rested on Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda was highly instrumental. It was definitely part of the dynamics of the Cold War. And what it did was it cast the Arab-Israeli conflict as world imperialism, suppressing a true national liberation movement. And it's in that propaganda that we first begin to see visuals of Israeli soldiers compared to Nazis. We see Zionism portrayed as a central agent of foreign capital. We see the view that Zionism is a racist ideology also emerges from Soviet material. This was not classical anti-Semitism of the Nazi variety. That would not have been allowed by Soviet ideology. Instead, the idea of a global Zionist conspiracy substituted for a specifically Jewish one. Now, if you fast forward a little bit, you can see how this has become so normalized and mainstreamed in parts of the left. Today, Zionism is associated with consummate evil. Here's an example of a t-shirt that was sold a few years ago at Netroots Nation. It's an important annual conference for progressive political activists, up-and-coming politicians. And here Zionism is inserted as a manifestation of everything the left should oppose. And you know, this is off campus, right, Netroots Nation, but this has long come onto campus. And so I just want to show a little bit of how anti-Zionism is manifesting on campus. And so what we see is, you know, anti-Zionism ranges from it's multivaried sort of effort. You can see exclusion of Jewish Zionist students from progressive causes and coalitions. You can see campaigns to discredit Hillel, which is the voice of Jewish culture and Jewish life on campus. On some campuses, we've seen the fitness of Jewish students to serve in leadership positions in student government questioned on account of their perceived Zionist beliefs. And the upshot, and this is long before October 7th, the upshot is that, you know, many Jewish students have been reporting for some years that they cannot fully express their identity on campus. And Deborah Lipstadt, a historian at Duke, she spoke out about this trend. You know, now she's at the State Department. She's the envoy for combating and monitoring anti-Semitism. But she's written quite extensively about this, and she's talked about how Jewish students feel like they have something to lose if they openly identify as a Zionist. So if they want to be part of Black Lives Matter, you know, if they want to be part of another type of progressive liberal coalition or cause, they may be excluded. On one SUNY campus, not far from where I live in Syracuse, 2 Jewish students were excluded from a sexual assault survivor group. At Tufts University, a Jewish club was told it couldn't join a fossil fuel divestment campaign, that they'd have to do their own climate change protest. And so, we see a lot of that kind of ostracism, exclusion, kind of shunning. And then we see hostile rhetoric as well. And so here are just a few examples where Zionism is equated to racism, is equated to white supremacy. This is at Harvard Yard last year, actually during Passover. Jewish student clubs, including clubs on the left, like J Street, accused as being racist, as having blood on their hands. It sort of triggers the blood libel. And some of you may have heard that at the University of Berkeley, about a dozen student clubs at the law school a couple years ago adopted a pledge: no Zionist speakers, on any topic, right? So on any topic, not just on Israel, Palestine, any topic, we will look to see if you are a Zionist. We will not invite you to speak at the law school. And Dean Chemerinsky at the time, had spoke out and said, well, you're basically excluding me from your programming. And about 90% of the Jewish students here. And again, these are all examples pre-October 7th, but we have seen a marked uptick since then. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a chalking on the main thoroughfare of the university a few days ago, quote, "Zionists, get off our quad." At Clark University in Massachusetts, an anonymous student, because you had to be a student to be on this official school channel, wrote, quote, "Zionists are subhuman vermin." And, at GW, there was a poster. It was a few hours for a time, then it was taken down. Quote, "Students will go back home when Israelis go back to Europe and the US, their real homes." So there are multiple examples like this. And I wanted to share one from my alma mater, Columbia University, because I very closely, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, am following what's going on there. And the president and co-founder of a student club for queer women, non-binary people of color, decided she would exclude most of her Jewish peers from a film event. This was at the end of October. She said, "It's free Palestine over here." And then she posted that on a public Instagram page, the club's public Instagram page, saying, "We are within our rights to disinvite Zionists because they are a genocidal group of people." Now, she was criticized, and she, in a subsequent email, actually doubled down and wrote, quote, "White Jewish people are today and always have been the oppressors of all brown people. When I say the Holocaust was not special, I mean that because Israelites are the Nazis." And I think it's important to name what that means, what we're seeing, that demands on young Jews to be less fully Jewish as the price of social acceptance. And in effect, they're being told, you can't be fully Jewish on campus. You can't bring your full self in. You can only be the kind of Jew that disavows Zionism. And by the way, that is not only happening to Jewish students. One of the faculty members in my organization, Corinne Blackmer, who's a scholar at Southern Connecticut University, is a Jewish lesbian. She was targeted a few years ago on her campus. She had her office vandalized, and threatening messages were left on her phone. She was called a pervert Zionist. And she describes in a book chapter and in her new book of only receiving support for having been victimized as a lesbian, but not being victimized as a Zionist, even though she was called a pervert Zionist. Now, most Jewish faculty don't have those kind of harrowing experiences that Corinne did, but in AAN, my organization, we are hearing from faculty members, especially junior, not yet tenured and contingent faculty members, adjuncts and part-time faculty, and they're saying, my job is already precarious enough, and I have to also hide my views on Israel and my beliefs, my Zionism, if I'm going to succeed professionally in my field and get promoted and get tenure. And so we have heard actually graduate students and some junior faculty saying they cannot go on a research trip to Israel because they cannot put that on their CV. They can't put that on their resume. It will not go well for them in P&T, right? In promotion and tenure meetings. And so this is self-censorship, right? There's a lot, when we hear a lot about self-censorship, right? In the academy in general, and it is going on among Jewish faculty. It's not in every discipline, but it is in some of the humanities and increasingly in some of the soft social sciences and bizarrely in public health and in other areas where Jewish faculty are just concerned about what they can say and do as it relates to Israel, as it relates to Zionism. Now, so far, we only really have anecdotal evidence of this. There are no surveys of faculty. AN is working with some other colleagues to develop such a survey, and we hope to roll it out in the summer. But we do have some really good data on this kind of ostracism and exclusion for students, for Jewish students. And a really good, well, because he's a member of AEN, so I like to promote our members' work. Eitan Hirsch, he's a political scientist at Tufts, and he surveyed 1,000 Jewish students and 1,500 non-Jewish students on 20 US campuses. He did that 2 years ago, and he did it again just recently. And he found that more than a quarter of Jewish college students surveyed feel like they need to hide their Jewish identity in order to fit in on campus. And a majority felt that they would be judged harshly and face a, quote, social penalty if they supported Israel's right to exist as a homeland of the Jewish people. And their non-Jewish peers agree with them. 1 in 5 who filled out the survey said they would not be friends with someone who supports Israel's right to exist. And you know, it is shocking when you see the data represented this way. Now, the remedy, in my view, and I think in the view of my organization and many of our faculty members, is not lawsuits or litigation that may be necessary actually in cases of discriminatory conduct. But rather it's education. It's more education around Jewish identity, Jewish history, and university officials can explain it, right? They can explain how, for many Jewish students, Zionism is central to an understanding of Jewish history, to ethnic, cultural, and religious identity for many Jews. They can help students understand and appreciate that anti-Zionism often lands as an attack on Jewish identity, even when that's not the intention, right? Impact is different from intent, but we do need to understand the impact. And I wanted to share, you know, and you'll get these slides so you don't have to copy this. It is online, but I just put some excerpts of a statement from University of Illinois that came out a few years ago, which offers an example of what that kind of education might look like coming from the diversity office and from the university administration, not just in the classroom, but from the administration. And when this came out, you know, the Zionism is integral part of the identity of many Jews on our campus. When this came out, many in the Jewish community said, big deal, it's a piece of paper, it has not going to have any impact, statements don't matter. And I was like, well, I don't know, let's see what happens. And sure enough, a test case came out when a guest lecturer came to present a talk at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with the title, Zionism is Racism. And that was for a seminar series, Unfinished Business, Zionism is Racism and Racial Discrimination. This was a guest lecturer coming. And the vice chancellor for diversity, equity, and inclusion at UIUC sent out a mass mail to the entire campus after the event. I thought it was very good. He distanced the DEI office from the talk's title, noting that's not really consistent with our statement on anti-Semitism. That's not really consistent with our university's values. The event was not canceled. Academic freedom was protected, but Jewish students felt seen and heard. They really did. They understood the event could not be canceled, but they felt very, very seen and heard by this statement. And I want to say something important before wrapping up in a few minutes. I believe that most young people on campus who gravitate to anti-Zionist groups and anti-Zionist discourse are not haters. They are committed to social justice. They have goodness in their hearts. I have met those students over the years in my teaching and in my career. I know you have met these students. The vast majority harbor no ill will toward Jews, and they will say that. The problem, I think, is that they don't often understand how their rhetoric sounds and feels to their Jewish peers on campus, how their speech lands on Jewish students. And as we know, words matter, right? And as educators, we know that rhetoric can be interpreted differently, right? So offensive and bigoted rhetoric is often ambiguous. It can be interpreted one way by supporters and another way by people who may feel targeted. And again, the distinction between intent and impact is so important here. So I'll just end off for a minute on these tent encampments that we're seeing, initially 20, then 50. Now I think there's some 80 encampments. Some are being dismantled, some are staying put. But all of them have a certain rhetoric, a certain messaging to them, right? And so what does it mean? What does free Palestine mean? What is from the river to the sea? Palestine is Arab, or Palestine will be free. What about calling for an intifada revolution? To many students in these protests, and I want to just be clear, there are a lot of external actors, outsiders who are coming onto the campus, manipulating students, and I don't think they have goodness in their heart. I'm talking about the 18, 19-year-old students who have matriculated to GW and other campuses and are part of social justice movements, and are very concerned and very compassionate. And for many of them, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It is a virtuous statement for hope for freedom and rights for a displaced people, for a stateless people. But to Jewish students and to other Jews on campus, these could be interpreted as a call for Israel's demise, even for a harm to its citizens. It can be messaging that's perceived as very threatening. There's an origin story of Free Palestine from the river to the sea, which is actually Hamas. And after October 7th, to many Jewish students, these kinds of messages are not going to be viewed as benign, nonviolent calls for democracy and coexistence, but the negation of Jewish safety. Several days ago, in an essay for the Chronicle of Higher Education, I came across a really useful article by Arash Azizi, where he noted that, quote, the idea that Jews don't belong in their own country and must go back to where their ancestors came from is chilling. And he called it anti-Semitism. I think the remedy is more education. And so I wanted to share, we're hearing a lot of negativity about Columbia. It's my alma mater. I'm very proud to be an alumna of Columbia. And when there's something positive to share, I want to share it. So I'm sharing the dean's message from Columbia, where 17 deans of Columbia's faculty signed this statement. I think it's an excellent example, another one of education, and differentiating between intent and impact and uplifting multiple communities, an urging of the campus community to better appreciate how anti-Israel chants and slogans are landing on Jewish students. And they also advocate for pro-Palestinian expression, for expressing deep pain and anguish over the loss of life in Gaza. It is not anti-Semitic to say Palestinian lives matter. It doesn't make you a Hamas supporter or a terrorism supporter either. And I think that this last sentence here, extending, quote, the grace of compassionate engagement in equal measure to all members of our community, I just love that wording. And so I think I will end there. And I very much look forward to your comments and your feedback. And thank you very much. I will stop the share. Oh, I do have actually a thank you.
Don't forget
my
that.
email and my organization.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. We'll leave the AN email up there, or maybe one staff member could put it in I have really valued your counsel. There are about 99 things you said that I disagree with, but the one thing that I will say is that we all need a bit more compassion. You know,
And that's academia. It's all about
that is
debate
academia.
and respectful civil dialogue and discussion. And
Yes.